they too cannot be protected during hostilities by the SURD unless there is specific evidence that indicates misconduct capable of falling within the SURD. One might ponder why a difference is even being drawn between soldiers and civilians. They're both protected persons under IHL and under the SURD, and they were both murdered, tortured, detained, and disappeared in very similar ways. Why is one group completely off the table for the court's jurisdiction, while the other stays on the table so long as the table is properly set? Now, one possible interpretation of Azerbaijan's position is that they have carefully reviewed every single piece of evidence relating to violence against soldiers, and not a single one is capable of demonstrating racial animus, while for civilians, there may be such evidence. I'll leave it to Ms. McDonald to dispel that argument. But another possible interpretation of Azerbaijan's position is that there is something about violent acts against soldiers that, at least in this particular conflict, can only be explained as generalized antipathy between belligerent states, and can only be explained as understandable animosity between two states that have experienced the tragedy of war. On this interpretation, the tragedy of war in this particular conflict has displaced the SURD when it comes to acts of violence against soldiers, and moreover displaced the SURD when it comes to all acts of detention and enforced disappearance. Professor Boisson de Charzon was candid in taking this position when it came to detention, citing specifically to the Third and Fourth Geneva Conventions. Yet arguing that IHL displaces the SURD when it comes to detention is problematic, given that IHL itself requires treating prisoners of war and civilian internees, quote, without any adverse distinction founded on race or any similar criteria, end of quote. Indeed, the prohibition on racial discrimination cuts across both fields such that there is no lex specialis. Similar to the relationship between IHL and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, both spheres of law are complementary, not mutually exclusive. In any event, if we are going to get into questions of whether there is a lex specialis on particular issues such as repatriation that relate to particular facts, such as whether the prosecution of a specific POW is allowed under IHL, then that is clearly an issue for the merits, where both sides can marshal the facts and law as they wish. For present purposes, the only issue is whether the alleged conduct concerning detention is capable of violating the SURD, which surely it is. However one might understand Azerbaijan's position, Mr. President, Armenia stands by its submissions from Tuesday. It is common ground between the parties that in situations of armed conflict, the applicability of IHL does not preclude the application of the SURD, which operates independently. The court has said this, and the SURD committee has said this. And such reasoning is consistent with the court's view that certain acts or omissions may give rise to a dispute that falls within the ambit of more than one treaty. Given the evidence that we have submitted, the claims to which Azerbaijan objects are capable of violating the CERD regardless of any connection to IHL. And as a final point on this issue, if Azerbaijan's position is that claims concerning soldiers and civilians during the so-called active hostilities phase of armed conflict fall entirely or largely outside the CERD, then that position is certainly in tension with the court's prior findings on plausibility in its provisional measure orders in this case. That there were IHL implications to the conduct we allege was well known to the court right from the start of this case. But the court did not see IHL as an obstacle when finding it plausible that CERD rights were at issue concerning soldiers and civilians caught up in hostilities. Mr. President, members of the court, I turn to my second point, which is that Azerbaijan cannot avoid the implications for this jurisdictional phase of the widespread ethnic hatred that it promotes and condones. Azerbaijan's principal gambit on Wednesday seems to have been to pivot away from saying that general Armenophobia is essentially irrelevant for this phase of the proceeding, to saying that it's the only evidence that Armenia has, and moreover, such evidence does not demonstrate ethnic or racial animus. As such, according to Azerbaijan, the second objection prevails. The first problem with that argument is that, as I stated Tuesday, Armenia has presented abundant, direct evidence of the racial motivation behind each and every claim it has asserted. Mr. Wordsworth boldly claimed that my statement was plainly wrong, but then he didn't tell us why it is wrong. Indeed, Azerbaijan has been relatively silent in scrutinizing all the evidence that we have placed before the court, as the speakers that follow will explain. Rather, Azerbaijan seems content to poke at random pieces of evidence while desperately advancing last-minute translations that do not bear up under scrutiny. A further problem is that Azerbaijan's efforts to discount the evidence of general Armenophobia make little sense. Mr. Ahi strained mightily on Wednesday to demonstrate that terms such as wild beasts, predators, jackals, or a savage tribe are terms that can only be understood as referring to a foreign occupying force, or to the leadership directing those operations, or to the forces of the illegally installed regime. But as the court well knows, that is not how racism works. Racism is an insidious attitude that often manifests through particular types of epithets, phrases, terms, and slogans. Racism is also best understood through the context in which it occurs, whether one labels it background context or relevant factor or something else. And this background context is quite ugly. I will not take the court through all the statements made by President Aliyev that were raised by Mr. Ahi on Wednesday, which are, after all, a mere fraction of our evidence. But in our view, those statements do demonstrate racial animus, or, at a minimum for this jurisdictional phase, are capable of being so read. For example, on Wednesday, Azerbaijan argued that President Aliyev's statement, "Our main enemies are Armenians of the world," is not even capable of showing racial animus. Azerbaijan insists this phrase refers benignly to Azerbaijan's detractors, or those who don't like Azerbaijan. But the phrase Armenians of the world certainly is not referring to a particular country, or to a particular country's leadership, or to its army. The phrase clearly is referring to an entire ethnic group, wherever in the world that group may be found, which includes in Azerbaijan itself. And the phrase is saying that those ethnic Armenians are our main enemies. It was equally interesting seeing Counsel for Azerbaijan trying to explain away President Aliyev's references to chasing people like dogs. Here, too, the assertion this week is that dogs can only be understood as referring to the leaders of Armenia or of Nagorno-Karabakh, even though last year Azerbaijan conceded in its written objections that the term has a possible ethnic dimension. In any event, to sustain this week's explanation, Azerbaijan proudly displayed a BBC interview with President Aliyev. But notice the observation made by the reporter before President Aliyev responds. The BBC reporter observes, "You have very recently said," and I am quoting you here, "if they do not leave, we will chase them like dogs." Now that's hardly the kind of statement that would make people feel safe. Clearly, the interviewer did not think that dogs was just a clever way of referring to the leaders of Armenia or of Nagorno-Karabakh. Moreover, the reporter then observed, and I quote, "There is institutionalized messaging against the Armenians which takes place here as a part of the state dialogue. People have been primed to have hatred for the other side. Are you actually expecting them to be able to coexist?" End of quote. So while Azerbaijan has its own peculiar way of interpreting what President Aliyev means when he says, "We will chase them like dogs," that's not what anyone else is hearing. And it is notable the points we raised on Tuesday that even Mr. Ahi dared not touch. He dared not touch Azerbaijan's parliamentary committee, referring to Armenia and the Armenian diaspora as a cancerous tumor of Europe. He dared not touch Azerbaijan's senior official comparing Armenians to the Jews of the Holocaust, whom Azerbaijan seeks to eliminate. He dared not touch the grotesque mannequins placed in and then hastily removed from Azerbaijan's military trophy park. He dared not touch Azerbaijan's disinfection stamps, and so on. Azerbaijan's co-agent represented to the court on Wednesday that the patch we noted on Tuesday, which says Armenian don't run, is not worn by Azerbaijan soldiers. That's the first time we've heard such a denial, notwithstanding our having raised this patch as being worn by Azerbaijan soldiers in both our January 2023 memorial and at the October 2023 provisional measures hearing. Azerbaijan's denial happens to be inconsistent with media reports and think tank reports, in addition to social media postings, all of which also say it is a patch worn by an Azerbaijani soldier. In any event, if Azerbaijan wants to contest that proposition at the merits stage, it is free to do so, perhaps by telling us who does wear such a patch that so widely and proudly circulates on social media in Azerbaijan. But there is no need to rely solely on Armenia's interpretation of these facts. Indeed, the court has abundant evidence as to what third parties think about whether Azerbaijan's government generally promotes and condones widespread ethnic hatred against ethnic Armenians. The Council of Europe's Advisory Committee on the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities does not accept Azerbaijan's interpretations of its government statements. Rather, the Advisory Committee has observed, and I quote, a very persistent public narrative surrounding the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, identifying variably Armenia or Armenians as the enemy and openly promulgating hate messages, end of quote. Moreover, it expressed deep concern at the levels of official involvement in endorsing and disseminating such views, which were directed both against Azerbaijani citizens of ethnic Armenian origin, as well as anybody else who may be seen as affiliated with Armenia. The European Commission on Racism and Intolerance does not accept Azerbaijan's interpretation of its government's statements. ECRI has found that Azerbaijan's leadership, education system, and media are very prolific in their denigration of Armenians, so much so that an entire generation of Azerbaijanis has now grown up listening to this hateful rhetoric. The Third Committee does not accept Azerbaijan's interpretation of its government's statements. Rather, as you will see on the screen and at tab 2 of your judge's folder, at paragraph 27, the committee has expressed concern at the repeated and unpunished use of inflammatory language by politicians speaking about the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and at its adverse impact on the public's view of ethnic Armenians in Azerbaijan. And I will leave the court with this point. If Azerbaijan is right that everything its government says, from President Aliyev on down, can only be interpreted as having nothing to do with the Surd, if they're right that all these statements are simply directed at the leaders of Armenia or of Nagorno-Karabakh or at a foreign army, if that was so clear to everyone that these statements were not threats to ethnic Armenians generally, then why, in September of 2023, did more than 100,000 ethnic Armenians, including 30,000 children, within a matter of days, flee from their ancestral homeland as the Azerbaijani army approached? if it was so obvious that the years of threats recounted in our evidence, the years of invective against Armenians of the world, only concern threats to the country of Armenia, then why did so many persons, who Azerbaijan claims to be its own citizens, desperately flee for their lives? Could it possibly be that they did not interpret references to chasing dogs as only referencing senior governmental leaders? Could it be that they feared the exterminator soldier that Azerbaijan so proudly placed on its postage stamps? Could it be that they anticipated not just the destruction of their democratic institutions and not just the final cleaning of those ruins by President Aliyev's bonfire, but of their own final cleaning if they did not flee? No. What is abundantly clear is that the words of Azerbaijani officials were rightly understood by the entire population of ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh as being aimed not only at government leaders, but at themselves and at their children. It's for this reason that they fled their homes for an uncertain future. This threat and the perception it created, cultivated over decades by the government of Azerbaijan, is highly relevant when establishing that the alleged acts of violence, detention, and enforced disappearance are capable of violating the CERD.